After Benjamin's demise, I found myself a widowed Omega dwelling in isolation. That's when I discovered I could hear everyone's innermost voices. Benjamin's elder brother, the cold and detached heir to the family fortune, considerately draped his coat across my shoulders and told me to take care of myself. His innermost voice. That waist is so slender I could wrap one hand around it completely. I want to pin this little widowed Omega against my brother's coffin. Immediately, Benjamin's closest friend offered me a glass of warm water. His innermost voice so intoxicating it's driving me insane. I want to taste him until he weeps and completely erase that mark. And every night, a voice so deep it chilled me to the bone would whisper in my ear, filled with possessive longing and burning fury. Baby, can't you smell how you're already drenched in all these wild alpha scents? Think just because your husband's gone, no one can distract you anymore. My alpha husband perished in a car crash. As his legal partner, I naturally became his lingering estate. Left in this world and Omega forced into widowhood just after marriage. The family memorial hall echoed with suppressed weeping. I stood quietly before Benjamin's memorial tablet, holding a black umbrella, my eyes downcast. Whispered conversations drifted to me through the wind. It's been less than 2 weeks since the alpha died. Poor Omega, widowed at such a young age. The Hamilton family is complicated. Who knows how Benjamin really perished? I heard William is quite distant toward his brother's widow. I bet this Omega won't receive any inheritance and will be expelled from the family. A cold wind picked up, making me cough softly. Without warning, a dark gray cashmere coat, still warm with body heat, was draped across my shoulders. My eyelashes fluttered as I looked up at the coat's owner. It was William, Benjamin's half-brother and the real power behind the Hamilton family. He was a full head taller than me. His perfectly tailored black suit, making his frame look tall and strong as a pine tree. His face showed no extra emotion. His deep eyes like an unfathomably cold pool of ice, reflecting my pale face. It's cold out here. Don't fall ill. William lowered his eyes. His voice deep and steady, maintaining the same distant coldness he always showed me. My condolences, take care of yourself. William and I weren't close. I nodded slightly. That's when I heard the strange voice. Explicit, almost crude words in William's distinctive, deep tone crashed into my mind without warning. How can that waist be so thin? One hand could wrap around it. I want to press this little widowed Omega against my brother's coffin right now, and make him cry until he loses control. I looked up in disbelief at this alpha, who appeared so cold and restrained before everyone. But William's lips were closed, his expression unchanged. Was I hallucinating? Such blasphemous words couldn't possibly come from someone so consistently cold and noble. But he seemed completely unaware of the storm raging in my mind. Instead, he naturally reached out and adjusted the collar of the coat that still held his warmth. His fingertips barely brushed the skin on my neck. You're trembling. I'm not. I instinctively shrank back, almost wanting to escape the scents that were so similar to Benjamin's. It was normal for brothers to have similar scents. But even though they were just similar, the scents William was releasing were colder and more dominating than Benjamin's, easily igniting my barely controlled biological instincts. I lowered my eyes, my expression darkening beyond recognition, barely able to suppress the inappropriate desire stirring within me. The people outside hadn't noticed my condition. Don't be too sad. Death comes to everyone eventually. William's voice was deep and calm, carrying just the right amount of grief. He wouldn't want to see you like this. William's expression remained composed, his eyes holding a trace of sympathetic warmth. His emotional control was perfect. At the same time, that voice only I could hear from deep in William's heart rang clearly in my mind. Again. Just a little similar scent and he becomes this fragile. I wonder how beautiful he'd look crying if I really went hard on him. A chill instantly shot through my spine. I knew I wasn't hallucinating and there was no way I could be mistaken. Again, what I was hearing were William's deepest desires. He was coveting his dead brother's widow. I don't know how I got out of there. I just knew that if I stayed any longer, just standing there, would make me consumed by William's possessive thoughts. Benjamin's best friend Derek was waiting outside. When he saw me come out, he approached. "Hey, Noah." Derek seemed more distant now. When Benjamin was alive, used to call me brother-in-law. He handed me warm water from a thermos. "Noah, you look pale. Drink something warm." Just as I took the warm water and lowered my head, an excited, almost twisted voice exploded in my mind. "So intoxicating it's driving me crazy. I want to lick Noah until he cries and completely cover that mark." This was Derek's thoughts. My hand holding the cup trembled imperceptibly. And a few drops of water clearly spilled out. If William's voice earlier could have been an illusion, now I was certain I could hear other people's thoughts. My legs felt weak. Derek looked concerned. "Noah, what's wrong?" I didn't know what was wrong with me. I uncomfortably tugged at the suppression collar around my neck. "It's so hot." William's scents earlier were too similar to the mark Benjamin had left. At some point, they had triggered a false heat. Derek quickly realized what was happening. Thinking he's actually going into heat. Would Benjamin know that the Omega he treasured enough to want to hide away would get this wet for other alphas? At his own funeral, even with a suppression collar on. If Benjamin's alpha level wasn't so high, I'd want to cover Noah's mark right here. Because of the false heat. I was dizzy and swaying. Derek supported my shoulder. His voice gentle and soft. "Noah, if you're not feeling well, let me take you home." When the car stopped in front of the villa, it was already evening. I held onto the car door. "Just drop me off here." Derek looked up, speaking slowly. "Okay." Seeing him still standing there, my fingers tightened slightly. "Derek, you aren't leaving. Benjamin is dead. I'm worried about you." Derek spoke flatly without much emotion. "I rented the house across the street. I can look after you from now on as Benjamin's best friend." Looking after his widow seemed like Derek's duty. But moonlight slanted through the hallway window, clearly illuminating the dark currents in Derek's eyes. My eyelashes quickly lowered. And under Derek's barely concealed lustful gaze, I slammed the door shut. Watching the Omega's panicked figure disappear behind the door, Derek chuckled softly and loosened his tie. Just now he had left a bit of his scent on Noah's glands. But this Omega was clearly like a frightened bird, and hadn't noticed his little extra attention at all. This was just a test. No matter. He had plenty of patience. The only thing that annoyed him was not knowing which wild dog had gotten there first. And also left scents on Noah's body. TSK. How annoying. Derek thought silently. When would he be able to kill all the wild dogs coveting his Omega? Benjamin and I had a very distant relationship. It was a business marriage. But his alpha scent level was very high. During the 7 days of permanent marking, I could barely do anything but sit on his lap, drowning in his scents. Benjamin had moved out of the main Hamilton family house long ago. After he died, I was alone in the empty room. I wrapped myself tightly in the clothes I'd used for nesting, hoping this would ease my anxiety. I don't know how much time passed before my consciousness gradually faded into the night. I closed my eyes tightly, seemingly encountering Benjamin in my dreams. My dead husband. I shook my head, wanting to dismiss it as a bad dream. But a voice so cold it chilled me to the bone rose up, wrapped in intense possessiveness and towering rage. It burned my ears, giving me no peace. Even in dreams, baby. I frowned uneasily and bit my lip in my sleep. But that familiar cold laugh didn't fade away. Instead, it became more real. As if someone had crawled back from the grave. Your husband's body isn't even cold yet. And you're already learning to cheat behind my back. The words crashed through my consciousness like shattered glass, each syllable cutting deep. My eyes snapped open, pupils dilating against the suffocating darkness that pressed down on me like a physical weight. The bedroom felt smaller than it should, the walls closing in, the air too thick to breathe properly. My heart slammed against my ribcage with such violence I was certain it would bruise from the inside out. For one disorienting, terrible moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then reality rushed back in fragments, the villa. Benjamin's villa. Our villa, though calling it ours, had always felt presumptuous when our marriage had been nothing more than a contract signed in expensive ink, witnessed by lawyers who'd barely looked at us before returning to their briefcases. 43 days we'd lived here together as husband and husband before the car crash that had shattered everything. 43 days. Not even long enough to learn how he took his coffee in the morning, though I'd learned how he liked to mark an omega during those 7 relentless, overwhelming days of permanent bonding. I'd stood at his funeral just 2 weeks ago, 14 days that felt like 14 years. I'd watched the polished mahogany casket, so expensive it probably cost more than most people earned in a year, being lowered into the earth by some mechanism that ground with mechanical precision. The sound had been terrible, that steady metallic clicking as it descended into that perfectly rectangular hole in the ground. I'd felt the autumn rain soaking through my black wool coat, cold droplets mixing with the tears I couldn't quite manage to shed in front of the Hamilton family, who watched everything with calculating eyes. I'd thrown my single white rose onto the casket lid, heard it land with a soft thump that had somehow echoed in my chest like a second heartbeat. The finality of it had nearly driven me to my knees right there in the manicured cemetery grass. He was dead. Gone. Buried 6 feet under earth that would gradually compress around him until spring brought new grass to hide even the scar of his grave. So why could I feel the unmistakable depression in the mattress beside me? Why was there heat radiating from a space that should have been empty and cold? The scent hit me like a physical blow, washing over me in waves so potent I gasped involuntarily. It cut through the fog of sleep like a blade through silk, sharp, undeniable, impossibly real. My omega instincts recognized it with the kind of bone-deep certainty that bypassed all rational thought, Benjamin's scent. But this wasn't the faint trace that had been slowly fading from the clothes in my nesting pile, growing more ghost-like with each passing day until I'd begun to fear I was forgetting the exact combination of notes that made it uniquely his. This was fresh and potent and alive, saturating the air with the complex blend I'd memorized during our marking week. Cedar and something darker, like rain-soaked earth after a storm. Expensive whiskey aged in oak barrels. Clean sweat, and underneath it all, something ineffably alpha that made my mouth water and my hands tremble. And there was something different about it now. Something that made my pulse race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear or grief. The scent was darker than I remembered, carrying an edge of raw possession that felt almost predatory. It reminded me of the way he'd smelled during those 7 days, not the polite, controlled alpha who'd maintained careful professional distance in public, but the one who'd held me down against Egyptian cotton sheets and marked me with an intensity that had bordered on feral, that had made me forget my own name by the 3rd day. Benjamin? The word scraped past my lips as barely more than a breath, my throat constricting so tightly I could hardly force air through. Fear and something else, something hot and confusing that I absolutely refused to examine too closely, twisted through my chest in complicated knots that pulled tighter with each racing heartbeat. A low chuckle resonated in the darkness, the sound rolling through the room like distant thunder. It sent shivers cascading down my spine, each vertebra lighting up with sensation as though he'd trailed ice-cold fingers down my bare back. "Did you miss me, baby?" The endearment hit me like a slap. He'd never called me that during our brief marriage. We'd been so formal with each other, so careful to maintain the professional distance appropriate to a business arrangement. It had always been Noah in that neutral tone, or sometimes just a questioning hum when he'd needed my attention at family dinners. My hand shot out instinctively, fingers fumbling across the smooth surface of the nightstand until they found the lamp. The switch clicked beneath my thumb, and warm golden light flooded the room, banishing the shadows and revealing what should have been utterly impossible. Benjamin sat on the edge of my bed, though technically it was his bed in his house that I was merely occupying as his widow, dressed entirely in black. Not the designer suits I was accustomed to seeing him wear, but dark jeans that looked lived in rather than pressed, soft from multiple washings. A black t-shirt stretched across shoulders I'd memorized with my hands during our marking week, clinging to muscles I'd felt flex and shift above me. His feet were bare, and somehow that detail felt more intimate than anything else, more real. I could see his toes curling slightly against the carpet, grounding him in physical reality. He looked exactly as I remembered, yet completely transformed. The sharp jawline that could have been carved from marble hadn't changed. I'd spent hours studying its angle during formal dinners, watching it flex when he was annoyed by his family's political maneuvering. Those penetrating dark eyes that had always seemed to see through every defense I'd ever constructed were the same, stripping me bare without a single touch. The way his hair fell across his forehead, slightly too long for the Hamilton family standards, still made my fingers itch to push it back. But there was something rawer about him now, something that thrummed beneath the surface of his skin like barely contained electricity. The polish was gone, that careful veneer of the perfect Hamilton heir had been stripped away, leaving something more primal underneath. He looked like a man who'd been to hell and crawled his way back through fire and broken glass, emerging on the other side not quite the same as he'd been before. There was a wildness in his eyes that the controlled businessman had never shown, something almost feral that made my omega instincts sing with both alarm and an attraction so intense it frightened me. His gaze traveled over me slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail with the kind of attention that made my skin flush hot. I became acutely, uncomfortably aware of how I must look, wearing one of his old dress shirts that hung off my shoulder, exposing the permanent mark he'd left there. The bite was fully healed now, just a silvery scar in the shape of his teeth, but it felt like it was burning under his stare. My hair was messy from sleep, sticking up in directions that probably looked ridiculous. My lips were swollen from where I'd been biting them in dreams I could no longer remember. The thin cotton of his shirt did absolutely nothing to hide the way my body was reacting to his presence, to his scent saturating every breath I took. My nipples had tightened into hard points that were probably visible through the white fabric, and I could feel the telltale heat beginning to pool low in my belly despite my confusion and fear. "You look good in my clothes," he said quietly, his voice dropping to that lower register that I remembered from late nights when he'd whispered filthy things against my ear. There was something possessive in the way he said it, something that made heat coil tighter in my core. But then again, you always did. I hadn't known that. We'd barely spoken during our short marriage outside of necessity and social obligation. How could he have noticed what I wore to bed? "You're supposed to be dead," I managed to force out, struggling to regain some control over the situation, over my body's betraying responses. Every rational part of my brain screamed that this couldn't be real, that grief must have finally shattered something fundamental inside my psyche. Maybe I'd finally broken under the combined weight of everything, the funeral that had felt like a performance, the predatory attention from William with his calculating eyes and Derek with his hungry stares, the crushing isolation of widowhood at barely 26 years old. Maybe this was what insanity looked like, conjuring the ghost of a husband I'd barely known in life, let alone in death. Creating this vivid fantasy to comfort myself against the loneliness that pressed down on me in the dark hours before dawn. I'd read about grief hallucinations in the psychology books I'd devoured after the funeral, desperate to understand what was happening to me. About widows and widowers who saw their dead spouses in crowds, who heard their voices in empty rooms, who felt phantom touches in the night. Was that what this was? Had my mind finally rebelled against the impossibility of my situation, creating this elaborate delusion to give me what I needed? But hallucinations didn't make the mattress dip with real, measurable weight. They didn't flood the room with pheromones so potent they made my mouth water and my hands shake. They didn't look at me with eyes that held secrets and promises and barely restrained hunger that felt viscerally, terrifyingly real. Benjamin's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, a smile I recognized from business dinners and family gatherings, the one he'd worn when dealing with people he didn't trust. But now it was aimed at me, and I didn't know what to make of that. "And you're supposed to be mourning me, Noah." He leaned forward, his presence filling the remaining space between us until I could count the individual lashes framing those dark eyes, until I could see the faint scar on his chin from some childhood accident he'd never told me about. Wearing black. Weeping. Staying faithful to my memory. His hand reached out, and I flinched instinctively, but he didn't pull back. His fingers brushed along my neck where Derek had touched me earlier, and I felt him tense, felt the sudden flash of something dangerous cross his features. Yet here you are, drenched in other alpha scents. William's coat on your shoulders at my funeral. Derek's hands on your body, his scent marking your skin like a claim. The accusation in his voice stung more than it should have, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. I didn't, they were just being kind, the words tumbled out defensive and weak, and I hated how small I sounded. Kind? Benjamin's laugh was sharp, bitter, like broken glass grinding together. Is that what we're calling it now? He leaned closer still, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could see the muscle jumping in his jaw from tension. William draping his coat across your shoulders, breathing in your scent while you stood beside my coffin. Derek offering you water, finding excuses to touch you, to leave traces of himself on your skin. They've already started marking their territory, haven't they? Like dogs circling fresh meat, waiting to see which one of them gets to feast first. The crude imagery made me recoil. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it? His eyes bored into mine, and I saw something flash in their depths, pain, maybe, or possessive fury. I've watched them, Noah. I've seen the way they look at you when they think no one's paying attention. I know exactly what they want from you, and it has nothing to do with kindness or family obligation. You've watched? My mind struggled to process his words, to make sense of what he was saying. But you're supposed to be dead. How could you have been watching anything? Instead of answering, Benjamin's hand moved higher, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the intensity in his eyes. Tell me something, Noah. Did you mourn me at all? Or were you relieved to be free of our arrangement? The question hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. How could he ask that? How could he think? I mourned you, I said, and my voice cracked despite my best efforts to keep it steady. I stood at your funeral and I mourned you, even though we barely knew each other. Even though our marriage was just a contract signed for family politics and business advantage. I mourned the potential of what we might have become if we'd had more time. Something in Benjamin's expression softened fractionally. More time, he repeated, as though testing the words. Is that what you wanted? I don't know what I wanted, I admitted, the honesty tearing out of me before I could stop it. We had 43 days together, Benjamin. Most of those days you worked late and I ate dinner alone. We had 7 days of marking where you barely let me catch my breath, and then you maintained careful distance like I was a business associate rather than your husband. How was I supposed to know what to want from a marriage that felt more like a transaction than a partnership? Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, his thumb still tracing absent patterns along my jaw. You're right, he said finally, and the admission surprised me. I treated you like a contract to be fulfilled rather than a person to be cherished. I told myself it was better that way, cleaner. That keeping emotional distance would make everything easier for both of us. And was it easier? I challenged, finding some of my courage returning. Easier for you to fake your death and leave me alone to deal with your family? Easier to watch from wherever you've been hiding while your brother and your best friend circled like predators? No. The word was flat, final. It was fucking torture. The raw honesty in his voice made my breath catch. Then why? I demanded. Why fake your death? Why put me through that? Why let me believe you were gone? Benjamin pulled back slightly, running his free hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration I remembered from the few arguments we'd had during our brief marriage. Because there were people who wanted me dead, Noah. Real threats, not hypothetical ones. People who would have used you to get to me if they'd known how much you. He stopped abruptly, seeming to reconsider his words. If they'd known you existed as anything more than a convenient political marriage. So you decided to die instead of trusting me with the truth? I decided to protect you the only way I knew how, he corrected, his jaw tight. By removing myself from the equation entirely. By making sure no one would think to use you as leverage against me. And the others? I pressed. William and Derek, you said you've been watching them. How? Benjamin's expression darkened. I have my sources. People loyal to me who've been keeping an eye on the situation. Who told me exactly how my brother looked at you at the funeral. How Derek moved into the house across the street, claiming he wanted to watch over you. How they've both been positioning themselves to swoop in and claim what they think is unclaimed territory. The possessiveness in his voice sent a complicated thrill through me, part arousal, part annoyance. I'm not territory to be claimed. No, he agreed immediately. You're not. You're my husband. My mate. The person I marked and bonded with, who carries my scent even now beneath all the others trying to cover it. His hand moved to my shoulder, fingers tracing the edge of the permanent mark with a touch so light it made me shiver. And I failed to protect you from the vultures in my own family. Before I could respond, before I could process the implications of everything he was saying, Benjamin stood in one fluid movement. He paced to the window, his back to me, shoulders tense with barely contained energy. I came back tonight because I couldn't stay away any longer. Because watching from the shadows while they touched you, while they thought they had a chance, he broke off, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I'm going to fix this. How? The question came out more desperate than I intended, but I couldn't help it. Your family thinks you're dead. If you just reappear, there will be questions. I know. Benjamin turned to face me, and in the lamplight I could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the dark circles that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. I'm not planning to reveal myself yet. Not until I've dealt with the remaining threats and tied up loose ends. But I am going to make sure William and Derek understand that you're still very much under protection. That you're not available for their schemes or their desires. The possessiveness in his tone should have annoyed me, should have made me bristle at being treated like property. But instead, I found myself feeling something else entirely, relief, maybe. Or perhaps it was simply the comfort of knowing I wasn't as alone as I'd believed. You can't just come back from the dead and expect everything to go back to normal, I said, wrapping the blanket around myself more tightly, suddenly cold despite the heat radiating from Benjamin's body. And you can't control who talks to me or how they behave. I'm not trying to control you. Benjamin moved back toward the bed, sitting down close enough that our knees almost touched. The mattress dipped under his weight, and his scent wrapped around me like a physical thing. I'm trying to protect you from men who see you as an opportunity rather than a person. Men who are using your vulnerability and grief to position themselves for their own gain. His hand reached out, fingers threading through mine, and the touch sent electricity racing up my arm. You haven't heard what they think about you, Noah. The things they say when they believe no one's listening. But I have. A chill shot through me as I remembered the voices I'd been hearing, William's crude thoughts about my waist, about pressing me against Benjamin's coffin. Derek's twisted desires about covering Benjamin's mark, about making me weep. How could you possibly know what they're thinking? Benjamin's expression shifted to something almost sheepish, a look I'd never seen on his usually controlled face. That's complicated. Let's just say I have ways of knowing things I shouldn't. The point is, I know their intentions aren't innocent or protective. They see you as part of my estate to be divided up now that I'm supposedly gone. I wanted to argue, to insist I could handle myself against William's calculating coldness and Derek's hungry attention. But the truth was they'd both already unsettled me in ways I didn't fully understand. The ability to hear their thoughts, if that's truly what I'd been experiencing and not some stress-induced delusion, had given me a terrifying glimpse into desires that were anything but brotherly or friendly. And sitting here with Benjamin solid and real beside me, his hand warm in mine, I realized I didn't want to face them alone anymore. "What do you want me to do?" I asked finally, hating how small my voice sounded, how dependent. "Trust me," Benjamin said simply, squeezing my hand. "Let me handle this my way. I won't reveal myself fully yet, that would complicate things in ways neither of us can afford. But I can work from the shadows. Make it very clear that you're still under protection, still claimed, still very much off limits to anyone with ideas about swooping in as the new alpha in your life." He leaned closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel his breath against my lips. "I know I have no right to ask for your trust after what I put you through. But I'm asking anyway. Let me protect you the way I should have been doing all along." Looking into his eyes, seeing the genuine regret and determination there, I found myself nodding before my logical brain could list all the reasons this was a terrible idea. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll trust you." Benjamin's expression softened into something that looked almost like relief. "Thank you." Then he was leaning in, closing the last few inches of distance between us, and his lips met mine in a kiss that was nothing like the perfunctory pecks we'd exchanged during our wedding ceremony. This kiss was possession and promise and apology all wrapped together. It was gentle despite the intensity one could feel thrumming through his body, tender in a way that made my chest ache. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb stroking along my cheekbone as he deepened the kiss, and I found myself responding despite everything, leaning into him, into this impossible reality. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Benjamin rested his forehead against mine. "I'm going to make this right," he murmured. "All of it. I promise." The next several days passed in a surreal haze. Benjamin came and went like a ghost, always after dark, always careful to leave no trace beyond his lingering scent that seemed to cling to my space. He refused to tell me specific details of his plan, insisting that my ignorance would make my reactions more genuine when dealing with William and Derek. I went through the motions of my prescribed life as a grieving widow, accepting condolences from distant Hamilton relatives who'd never spoken to me when Benjamin was alive, sorting through his belongings at the family's request, attending tedious meetings with lawyers about the estate that made my head spin with legal jargon. All the while, William and Derek continued their carefully orchestrated approaches. William had taken to stopping by the villa under various pretenses, retrieving documents from Benjamin's study, checking on property maintenance, ensuring I had everything I needed. He'd sit in Benjamin's leather chair, going through files with meticulous attention, but I could feel his gaze tracking me whenever I moved through the house. His thoughts, which I continued to hear with disturbing clarity, were a constant stream of possessive calculation. Asterisk, she's still wearing his scent, but it's fading. Another few weeks and she'll be ready. The family won't object to me taking an interest, they'd probably prefer keeping Benjamin's widow within the family rather than watching her slip away to someone outside. Asterisk. Derek, meanwhile, had indeed rented the house across the street. I'd see him watching from his window sometimes when I pulled back the curtains in the morning. He'd appear at my door with increasing frequency, always with some excuse, bringing groceries he claimed he'd bought too much of, offering to help with household tasks, suggesting we get coffee to talk about Benjamin and process our shared grief. His thoughts were more visceral, more immediate. Asterisk, God, the way that shirt clings to him. Benjamin never appreciated what he had. If I were the one who'd marked him, I'd never let him out of bed long enough to feel lonely. I'd make sure he understood exactly what it means to belong to someone. Asterisk. The constant barrage of their desires was exhausting, invasive in a way that made me feel violated even when they maintained physical propriety. I found myself retreating further into the villa, limiting my interactions, counting down the hours until darkness fell and Benjamin would appear. During those nighttime visits, we talked. Really talked, in a way we never had during our brief marriage. I learned about his childhood in the Hamilton family, raised by nannies and tutors while his father focused on grooming William as the heir. About his complicated relationship with Derek, who'd been his only real friend growing up, which made the current situation feel like a betrayal that cut deeper than anything else. Benjamin learned about my life before the marriage arrangement, about my dreams and fears and the strange ability to hear thoughts that had appeared the day he supposedly died. I think it was a defense mechanism, I told him one night as we sat together on my bed, my head resting against his shoulder. Like my brain knew I was in danger and gave me a way to see through the masks people wear. Or maybe it's part of the bond, Benjamin suggested, his arm tightening around me. Omegas sometimes develop heightened intuition with their mates. Maybe when you thought I was dead, that connection redirected itself to help protect you from other threats. It was a theory I hadn't considered, but it made a strange sort of sense. 3 weeks after Benjamin's secret return, things finally came to a head. William had arrived at the villa late in the evening, claiming he needed to urgently retrieve some documents from Benjamin's safe. I'd let him in, exhaustion making me careless about maintaining boundaries. "You know, Noah," William said, leaning against the doorframe of the study as I passed by carrying a cup of tea, "you don't have to stay in this house. It must hold painful memories. The family would understand if you wanted to move back to the main estate. It would be easier to take care of you there. Asterisk easier to keep an eye on you. Easier to make sure no one else gets access. Easier to position myself as your protector until you realize you need a new alpha in your life asterisk." "I'm fine," I replied, keeping my voice neutral despite the way my skin crawled at his thoughts. "I prefer my privacy." "Privacy," his thoughts sneered. Asterisk he says that like he doesn't know how desperate he is for an alpha's touch. That false heat the other day wasn't entirely false, was it? His body knows it needs to be claimed properly, even if his mind hasn't caught up yet asterisk. I kept walking toward the kitchen, determined to escape his presence, but William followed. His footsteps were deliberate and measured against the marble floor, each one seeming to echo through the empty house. "Noah." His hand caught my wrist, gentle but firm enough to stop my forward momentum. The tea sloshed dangerously close to the rim of my cup. "Your family now. Benjamin's death doesn't change that. You're a Hamilton, and Hamiltons take care of their own." Asterisk such a delicate wrist. I bet I could wrap my whole hand around it with room to spare. Benjamin was always too cautious with him, too worried about being gentle. An omega like this needs to be claimed properly, reminded of his place asterisk. "Let me take care of you," William continued, his thumb rubbing slow circles against the inside of my wrist where my pulse was hammering. "Let me show you what it means to be truly protected by this family. I can give you everything Benjamin couldn't. Take your hand off my mate." The voice came from the shadows of the hallway, low and laced with deadly promise. William froze instantly, his grip on my wrist loosening as his eyes widened in genuine shock. I turned to see Benjamin emerge from the darkness, and he looked like violence incarnate, shoulders squared, jaw clenched, eyes blazing with territorial fury. "Benjamin?" William's voice cracked on the name, all his usual composure shattering. "But you're supposed to be dead?" Benjamin finished, moving to stand between William and me with predatory grace. Clearly, that didn't work out as planned. He gently pulled me behind him, his body a wall between his brother and me, and I could feel the tension thrumming through him like a live wire. "Now, I'm going to give you exactly 5 seconds to explain why you had your hands on my husband." William's face cycled rapidly through a dozen emotions, shock melting into confusion, confusion hardening into fear, and finally settling on a calculating coolness that reminded me exactly why he was the family's chosen heir. His alpha training kicked in, smoothing his expression into something more controlled. "This is impossible," he said, but his voice was steadier now. "We buried you. There was a body in that casket. The police confirmed the dental records." "Not mine," Benjamin said simply, his tone allowing no argument. "Now stop deflecting and answer my fucking question. Why were you touching Noah?" The profanity seemed to shock William almost as much as Benjamin's resurrection. The polished Hamilton heir never cursed, never lost control. But this version of Benjamin, raw and angry and protective, was clearly someone else entirely. "I was just," he looked unsteady, William's usual silver tongue seemed to be failing him, stumbling over words. "How long have you been alive?" Does father know? Does the family know? Why didn't you tell anyone? Why stage your death in the first place? The family doesn't know, Benjamin cut him off sharply. And they won't. Not yet. There are reasons for my continued death that don't concern you. He took a step closer to William, and I saw his brother, taller by 2 inches and broader by 20 pounds, actually take a step backward. But you're going to know one thing very clearly, William. You're going to understand this down to your bones. Noah is still mine. Still marked. Still claimed. Still protected. Whatever plans you and Derek have been cooking up, whatever schemes you've been running in your head about taking over my estate and my husband, consider them permanently cancelled. I watched William's face as understanding dawned, as he realized that Benjamin knew about his thoughts, his intentions, his desires. Derek? What does Derek have to do with any of this? Don't play stupid. It doesn't suit you. Benjamin's hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles going white with the effort of controlling himself. I know he's been sniffing around. I know you've both been circling like vultures, just waiting for enough time to pass that you could swoop in without looking too predatory. Waiting to see which one of you could claim Benjamin's grieving widow first. William's expression hardened, his pride clearly wounded. If you're alive, then you have responsibilities to this family. Business that can't be ignored just because you decided to play dead for whatever reason. Father will expect. I had my reasons, and they're none of your concern, Benjamin interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. Here's what's going to happen now, William. You're going to leave this house. Tonight. And you're going to stop these convenient visits and helpful gestures. You're going to stop looking at Noah like he's a piece of property waiting to be claimed. And you're going to spread the word, very carefully, very quietly, through the channels that matter, that Noah is still under protection. That anyone who tries to take advantage of his perceived vulnerability, who thinks they can use his grief as an opening, will answer to me personally. And if I don't? William's pride wouldn't let him back down completely, even facing his supposedly dead brother's fury. If I tell Father you're alive? If I tell the family that you faked your death? There will be questions, Benjamin. Investigations. They'll want to know why, what you've been hiding. Then I'll tell them exactly why I had to fake it in the first place. Benjamin's smile was cold enough to freeze water. I wonder how Father would react to learning about your side businesses, William. The ones that have nothing to do with the family company. The offshore accounts. The deals with organizations that would make the Hamilton name toxic if they came to light. The things you've been doing that put not just yourself but the entire family at risk. All the color drained from William's face in an instant. You wouldn't, he breathed. You can't prove. I can and I would, Benjamin assured him. I've been planning for contingencies, brother. I have documentation of everything. Names, dates, transfers. It's all tucked away somewhere safe, ready to be released if anything happens to me or mine. He paused, letting that sink in. So here's how this works, you back off from Noah completely, you keep your mouth shut about me being alive, and your secrets stay buried. Try anything else, and I'll burn your reputation to the ground along with any hope you have of taking over the family business when Father eventually steps down. William stood frozen for a long moment, clearly weighing his options, running calculations behind his eyes. Finally, he straightened his shoulders, attempting to salvage some dignity. Fine, he said tightly. Consider it handled. Good, Benjamin said, stepping aside just enough to gesture toward the door. Now get out. And tell Derek I'll be paying him a visit soon. I want everyone to be very clear on where things stand. William left without another word, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor in a rapid, retreating rhythm. The heavy front door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the chandelier in the foyer. As soon as we were alone, I turned to Benjamin, my hands shaking from adrenaline. That was incredibly stupid. You've shown yourself now. What if he goes straight to your father? What if he calls your bluff about the documentation? He won't, Benjamin said, and his confidence was absolute. William values his position too much. If the family learns what he's been doing behind their backs, the money laundering for organizations that make the mafia look like Boy Scouts, the insider trading, the blackmail schemes, he'll lose everything. His inheritance, his position, his freedom if the authorities get involved. He'll keep quiet to protect himself. He turned to face me fully, and some of the hardness melted from his expression. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you I was alive sooner. I'm sorry for everything you've been through these past few weeks. I wanted to stay angry with him, to push him away for all the pain and confusion and grief I'd endured. But standing there, looking into eyes that held genuine remorse and something that might have been affection, I found I couldn't maintain the distance. You're really alive, I whispered, finally allowing myself to fully believe it. You're actually here and real and alive. Really alive, he confirmed, pulling me into his arms. The embrace was warm and solid and exactly what I needed. And I'm not going anywhere again. The threats have been dealt with, the people who wanted me dead have been neutralized. I can start the process of coming back now. Not immediately, there are still loose ends to tie up, a story to construct that won't raise too many questions, but soon. I buried my face against his chest, breathing in his scent, feeling the steady thump of his heart beneath my cheek. What about Derek? Benjamin's arms tightened around me, his voice going hard again. Derek is a different problem entirely. He's been my friend since we were 8 years old. We've been through everything together. Discovering that he wants you, that he's been thinking about you that way. He shook his head, and I felt the movement against my temple. That's a betrayal that cuts deeper than William's opportunism ever could. That requires a face-to-face conversation. That conversation came 2 nights later. Derek had texted asking if he could stop by, claiming he'd found some of Benjamin's old photographs and wanted to return them. I'd agreed, with Benjamin's permission and presence, knowing this confrontation needed to happen for any of us to move forward. Derek arrived precisely on time. He'd always been punctual, carrying a small cardboard box that rattled with the sound of picture frames. But the moment he stepped through the doorway, his entire body went rigid. Every muscle locked up like he'd walked into an invisible wall. His nostrils flared, scenting the air, and his eyes darted around the foyer with sudden wariness that bordered on panic. New air freshener? He asked, but there was an edge to his casual tone, a tightness that suggested he knew something was very wrong. Smells different in here. Stronger. More. He trailed off, clearly unwilling to complete that thought out loud. Just airing out some of Benjamin's old things, I said, the lie coming surprisingly easily to my lips. It was getting overwhelming, having so much of his scent saturating everything. Derek's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. You shouldn't erase him so quickly, Noah. There was accusation in his voice, disappointment that felt like manipulation. He deserves better than that. He deserves to be remembered. Does he? The voice came from the kitchen doorway, cutting through Derek's words like a knife through butter. Benjamin emerged, and the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before, cold fury mixed with genuine hurt, betrayal etched into every line. Interesting sentiment from someone who's been trying to replace me before my body was even cold in the ground. Derek dropped the box like it had burned him. Photographs scattered across the marble floor, images of their childhood together, 2 boys, grinning at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders. Frozen moments of a friendship that felt like it was shattering in real time. Benjamin, Derek's voice cracked, all his usual smooth confidence evaporating. Fuck, you're alive? Surprise, Benjamin said flatly, the word devoid of any humor. So, Derek. My best friend. My brother in all but blood. The person I trusted with everything. Want to explain why you've been putting your scent on my mate? Why you moved into the house across the street like some kind of stalker? Why you've been looking at Noah like he's a meal you've been waiting years to taste? Derek's face cycled through rapid emotions, shock bleeding into guilt, guilt hardening into something that looked almost like defiance. You were dead, he said, and there was heat in his voice now, anger bubbling up. We're supposed to be. What was I supposed to do? Watch him suffer alone in this giant house. Watch other alphas circle him like prey. Someone had to protect him. Protect him? Benjamin's laugh was harsh and ugly. Is that what you call trying to cover my mark? Fantasizing about making him forget I ever existed? That's protection? You don't understand, Derek started, but Benjamin cut him off with a sharp gesture. I understand perfectly, Benjamin snarled, and I'd never heard him sound so feral. I heard your thoughts, Derek. All of them. Every filthy desire, every possessive urge, every plan you had for claiming what's mine. I know you've wanted what was mine for years. You stood beside me at my wedding, smiling and offering congratulations and toasting to our happiness, all while imagining yourself in my place. All while thinking about how you'd fuck my husband if you just had the chance. Derek's face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. You don't know what it's been like, he said, his voice rising. Watching you with him, knowing you don't even appreciate what you have. You married him for a business arrangement, Benjamin. A contract. A political alliance. You treated him like a beautiful object to be displayed at family dinners, not a person to be cherished. I actually care about him. Care? Benjamin moved closer, and Derek actually backed up a step. You care so much that you couldn't wait 2 weeks before trying to seduce him? You care so much that you moved across the street to monitor him like he's prey you're hunting? That's not care, Derek. That's obsession masquerading as concern. I stepped between them before this could escalate into something physical. Enough, I said firmly, looking at both of them. Both of you, enough. I turned to face Derek fully, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time since Benjamin's supposed death. Is it true? Have you been waiting for me? Wanting me? Derek's expression softened when he looked at me, and I saw something that might have been genuine affection underneath all the possessive desire. Noah, I never wanted to hurt you. But yes. I felt something for you since the day Benjamin introduced us 3 years ago. I tried to bury it, tried to be just a friend, tried to pretend it didn't tear me apart inside watching him treat our marriage like a business transaction. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. But when he died, when you were suddenly alone and grieving and vulnerable, I thought maybe, finally, I could. No, I said simply, and the word came out harder than I intended. Whatever you felt, whatever you hoped for, no. I'm not interested in being the prize you finally get to claim now that Benjamin's gone. I'm not some object to be passed between alphas like property. But he's not gone, Derek said, bitterness seeping into every word as he looked at Benjamin. Apparently, he's been here all along, watching like some kind of ghost. Playing games while the rest of us grieved and suffered. I was protecting him, Benjamin said quietly, and the raw honesty in his voice seemed to take some of the wind out of Derek's anger. From threats you know nothing about. From people who would have used Noah to get to me, who would have hurt him just to hurt me. And yes, from opportunists like you and William who saw his grief as an opening rather than something to be respected. Derek's shoulders slumped, some of the fight draining out of him. He looked between us, Benjamin standing protective and possessive, me wrapped in a shirt that clearly belonged to my supposedly dead husband, and seemed to finally accept the reality of the situation. So what now? He asked, his voice rough. You're just going to reappear? Come back from the dead and expect everyone to accept whatever explanation you give? Expect me to just go back to being your friend like nothing happened? Eventually, I'll stage my return, Benjamin confirmed. With a story that protects everyone involved. As for our friendship. He paused, and I saw genuine pain cross his features. I don't know if that's salvageable, Derek. What you've done, what you wanted to do, that's not something I can just forgive and forget. Derek looked at me one last time, and I saw layers of complexity in his expression, regret, longing, resignation, and underneath it all, something that might have been genuine care buried beneath all the selfish desire. I'm sorry, Noah. For everything. I did care about you, even if I went about it all wrong. Even if my feelings were selfish and opportunistic and wrong. He turned back to Benjamin, and there was a weight to his words when he spoke. You're a lucky bastard, you know that? Lucky to have someone like him. I hope you know that now. I hope you treat him better than you did before you died. I will, Benjamin promised, and the conviction in his voice felt like an oath. After Derek left, taking his photographs and his broken friendship and his unfulfilled desires with him, Benjamin and I stood in the quiet house. The weight of everything that had happened, the funeral, the grief, the predators circling, the revelations and confrontations, settled over us like a heavy blanket. I need to tell you something, I said finally, breaking the silence. Those voices I'd been hearing, William's thoughts, Derek's thoughts, it started the exact day you supposedly died. The day of your funeral. Benjamin's eyes widened with genuine surprise. You can hear people's thoughts? Their actual thoughts? Their inner voices, I clarified, trying to explain something I barely understood myself. The real feelings and desires they hide behind the masks they wear for the world. It's how I knew what William and Derek really wanted. It's how I knew I wasn't safe, even when they were being superficially kind and helpful. He pulled me close, one hand cradling the back of my head with surprising gentleness. Why didn't that ability work with me? You didn't know I was alive. You couldn't hear me thinking about you. I don't know, I admitted, pressing closer to his warmth. Maybe because you're my mate? Maybe the bond we share blocks it somehow, creates a different kind of connection that doesn't need that ability. I paused, considering. Or maybe you're just better at shielding your thoughts than others. You've always been good at maintaining masks. I'm glad, he murmured into my hair. There should be some mystery between us. Some privacy. Some things that are just ours without the intrusion of supernatural abilities or family politics. We stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, and it felt like something shifting fundamentally between us. We'd been thrust into marriage by family politics and business needs, had barely known each other when we'd gone through the marking ritual, had maintained careful distance throughout our brief time together. But this, standing in the quiet house, wrapped in each other's arms after facing down threats and betrayals together, this felt like the actual beginning of something real. What happens now? I asked quietly, my voice muffled against his chest. How do we move forward from all this? Benjamin considered the question carefully, and I felt his heart beating steady and strong beneath my cheek. We wait a few more weeks. Let things settle, let the dust clear. Then I'll arrange to be found, the victim of amnesia, maybe, or a kidnapping. Something that explains my absence without implicating the family in anything dangerous or raising questions we can't answer. His thumb traced gentle patterns on my back. And then we rebuild everything. Properly this time. No more business arrangements or political marriages. No more maintaining distance because we're afraid of what getting close might mean. We make this real. It already feels real, I admitted, the words coming easier than they should have. Even when you were supposedly dead, even with all the confusion and fear and grief, you were still the only one I wanted. The only alpha whose scent made me feel safe instead of hunted. His kiss was gentle and reverent, so completely different from the possessive intensity I'd felt radiating from William and Derek's thoughts. This wasn't about ownership or conquest or claiming territory. This was partnership, respect, affection, all the things our arranged marriage should have been from the beginning. I'm going to make you a promise, Benjamin said when we finally pulled apart, both breathing harder. No more secrets between us. No more disappearing without explanation. No more treating this marriage like a contract instead of a commitment. Whatever comes next, whatever challenges we face them together. As actual partners. As equals. I'd like that, I whispered, and meant it with everything in me. The weeks that followed were strange but peaceful in a way I'd never experienced. Benjamin stayed hidden from the family, coming to me only after dark when the streets were empty and quiet. But we used that stolen time to actually build something, to learn about each other in ways we'd never bothered to when our marriage was just a political arrangement. I discovered his dry, sardonic sense of humor that could make me laugh until my stomach hurt. His unexpected skill at cooking comfort food that reminded him of the nannies who'd raised him while his father focused on business. His complicated, painful relationship with his family legacy and the weight of expectations he'd never quite managed to meet. Benjamin learned about my dreams that had nothing to do with being an omega in a powerful family, about wanting to study art history, about traveling to see the paintings I'd only read about in books. He learned about my fears of being reduced to nothing more than my designation, about the loneliness of my life before our marriage. About the guilt I'd carried for not mourning him more desperately, for feeling relieved at the freedom his death had initially seemed to offer. We talked through the nights, making up for all the conversations we'd never had during our 43 days of actual marriage. And slowly, carefully, we built something that felt like genuine connection. William kept his distance, as promised or threatened depending on your perspective. I saw him at one mandatory family meeting about estate matters, and the look he gave me was pure calculation. He knew Benjamin was alive, knew that any move against me would have immediate and severe consequences, but I could practically see him filing the information away. Waiting for the right moment to use it to his advantage, because that's what Williams did. They calculated and planned and waited for opportunities. But for now, he maintained polite distance and careful propriety. Derek moved out of the house across the street within a week. I heard through the family grapevine, which flowed with information like blood through veins, that he'd taken an extended business trip to Singapore. Running from his feelings, probably, or maybe just giving himself space to process the explosion of his world. Either way, I was relieved to not have his longing stares and barely concealed desire adding layers of complication to my already complex situation. The ability to hear people's thoughts remained, though I learned to control it better as weeks passed. I could tune it out when I wanted privacy, focus on specific people when I needed to verify their intentions. It was still invasive and uncomfortable and ethically questionable, but it also meant I was never truly deceived. I could hear the false sympathy from Benjamin's extended relatives who wanted access to his estate. I could sense the genuine concern from the handful of family members who actually cared about people rather than just positions and power. It made navigating the social minefield of the Hamilton family significantly easier. And then, exactly 6 weeks after his supposed death, Benjamin reappeared to the world. The story had been carefully crafted by Benjamin and a handful of trusted allies I didn't entirely know about. He'd been kidnapped by business rivals who wanted leverage against the family. He'd been held in a remote location, vague enough that no one could investigate too closely, unable to contact anyone, surviving on minimal food and water. He'd finally managed to escape during a transfer between locations, disoriented and traumatized but alive. The family reactions were a complex tapestry of emotions. His father, the imposing patriarch of the Hamilton Empire, was suspicious, his eyes too sharp, his questions too pointed, but ultimately pragmatic. Having his younger son alive was politically useful, especially given Benjamin's connections in industries the family wanted to expand into. Questions could be suppressed if the outcome was beneficial. William's expression when Benjamin walked back into the family estate for the first time was perfectly calibrated surprise, shock and joy performed with the skill of someone who'd been practicing diplomatic faces since childhood. But I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, already adjusting his plans and strategies to account for this new reality, already calculating how to use this situation to his advantage somehow. And me? I played my part perfectly, like an actor who'd been rehearsing for weeks. The grateful spouse, overwhelmed with relief and joy, rushing into Benjamin's arms with tears streaming down my face and catching in my throat. The tears were real, even if the surprise wasn't. Having him back publicly, being able to touch him in daylight, to claim our relationship openly without hiding or fear, it felt like coming home after a long exile. The family threw a welcome-back celebration that weekend, a lavish affair at the main estate that was more about maintaining social appearances than genuine joy. Crystal chandeliers and string quartets and champagne that cost more than most people earned in a month. I stayed by Benjamin's side throughout the evening, his arm around my waist in a possessive gesture that was somehow also protective. His scent enveloped me in a way that broadcast clearly to every alpha in the elegantly decorated rooms. This Omega is claimed, marked, taken. Are you okay? Benjamin whispered to me during a quiet moment on the terrace, away from the noise and performance of the party. The night air was cool against my flushed skin, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden below. I looked up at him, this man who had faked his death to protect me, who had watched from shadows to keep me safe, who had confronted his brother and former best friend to defend our bond. I'm better than okay, I said honestly, and the truth of it settled into my bones. I'm home. He smiled, that rare genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face into something younger and lighter. So am I, Noah. So am I. In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm that felt almost normal, though nothing about the Hamilton family could ever truly be called normal. Benjamin handled the fallout from his disappearance and return with practiced ease, weaving a narrative that protected both the family's reputation and his own carefully guarded secrets. The business rivals he'd supposedly been kidnapped by were conveniently vague enough that no one could disprove the story. They might have been based in Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia or South America, depending on which version of the story you heard. But they were real enough in the abstract that the family took security more seriously, hired additional protection, implemented new protocols. William and I maintained a polite distance, like two people dancing around a shared secret. He never mentioned that night when Benjamin had confronted him in the villa, and I never brought it up. But I noticed he was more careful now, more respectful of boundaries both physical and social. Whether that was because he genuinely understood his mistake or simply because he knew Benjamin was watching and willing to follow through on threats, I didn't particularly care. The result was the same, I was safe from his calculating advances. Derek eventually returned from his extended trip abroad 6 months later, showing up at a family dinner looking thinner and more subdued. The easy friendship we'd had before, which I now realized had never been quite as uncomplicated as I'd thought, was gone, replaced by a careful formality that felt almost like mourning. He'd nod to me at family events, make polite small talk about weather and business and neutral topics that meant nothing. But he never lingered in my presence, never let his eyes wander below my face, never left traces of his scent where they didn't belong. It was better this way, healthier, even if sometimes I mourned the loss of what could have been a genuine friendship if circumstances and feelings had been different. The ability to hear thoughts faded gradually over those months, like a sense that had been heightened by trauma and stress, only to recede once I felt genuinely safe again. By the time Benjamin and I celebrated our first real anniversary, counting from his return rather than our original wedding, I could barely catch whispers of other people's inner voices anymore. I was grateful for its disappearance. That constant stream of other people's hidden thoughts and desires had been exhausting, invasive, a burden I was deeply happy to release back into whatever supernatural space it had come from. Benjamin and I transformed our marriage from a contract into something real and chosen. We moved out of the villa, too many memories, too much space, and into a smaller penthouse in the city, something that was ours rather than a family property saturated with Hamilton history and expectations. We traveled together, learning each other's rhythms and preferences and quirks. Weekend trips to art museums where I could stand for hours in front of paintings while Benjamin read quietly on nearby benches. Visits to family properties in different cities where we could explore without the weight of the main family watching. Small moments of normalcy that built into something larger and more substantial. We built a life that wasn't defined by duty or obligation or what our families wanted from us, but by genuine choice and growing affection. There were still challenges, of course. The Hamilton family didn't make anything easy, ever. Benjamin's position came with responsibilities he couldn't entirely escape, board meetings and charity galas and political maneuvering that sometimes kept him away for days at a time. But we faced them together, as actual partners, supporting each other through the complicated maze of family politics and business pressures. Just as he'd promised that night in the villa, standing in my bedroom like a ghost made flesh. One evening, almost exactly a year after Benjamin's resurrection, we sat on our penthouse balcony watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of amber and rose gold. His hand was laced with mine, our fingers intertwined naturally, and our bond mark, refreshed and renewed through genuine affection rather than biological imperative or political necessity, was warm against my skin. The city stretched out below us, lights beginning to twinkle as darkness slowly claimed the sky. The sounds of traffic and humanity created a distant symphony that felt peaceful rather than overwhelming. Do you ever regret it? I asked quietly, my thumb tracing absent patterns across his knuckles. The fake death, all the complications, everything that came after? The friendships that ended, the questions that still linger? Benjamin considered the question for a long moment, his profile outlined against the dying light. I regret the pain it caused you, he said finally, his voice thoughtful and honest. I regret that you had to face William and Derek alone, even for those few weeks. I regret that you stood at my funeral and grieved when I was alive and watching. He squeezed my hand, turning to look at me fully. But I don't regret coming back. I don't regret fighting for us, for this. What we have now, he gestured between us, encompassing everything we'd built together. It's worth every complication. Every burned bridge. Every difficult conversation. I leaned my head against his shoulder, breathing in his scent, familiar now in a way it hadn't been during our arranged marriage. Comforting rather than overwhelming. Home rather than obligation. I never thought a business marriage could turn into this, I admitted. Into something real and chosen and wanted. Neither did I, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. But I'm glad it did. I'm glad we did. The sun continued its descent, painting everything in golden light that felt almost sacred. And for the first time since that terrible day when I'd stood at Benjamin's funeral with rain soaking through my coat, I felt complete peace. Not because life was perfect, it wasn't, and it never would be with the Hamilton family's particular brand of complicated dysfunction. Not because all our problems had been solved, William still watched with calculating eyes at family dinners, Derek still carried the weight of broken friendship, the extended family still whispered about Benjamin's mysterious disappearance and convenient return. But because I'd found something I never knew I was searching for, a partnership built on honesty rather than contract, on trust rather than political advantage, on genuine love rather than biological imperative. The voices that had haunted me were silent now. The predators who had circled were gone or neutralized. And the man I'd married out of duty had become the person I'd choose over and over again, in any life, under any circumstances. We sat there as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, two people who'd found their way through deception and danger and death to something real. Something lasting. Something worth all the pain it had taken to build. Benjamin pulled me closer, whispering promises against my hair about all the tomorrows we'd share, all the adventures we'd have, all the ways he'd spend the rest of his life making up for those weeks when I thought he was gone. And as I settled into his embrace, feeling safe and warm and genuinely loved for the first time in my entire life, I knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be. Home. Safe. Loved. Known. Finally, perfectly, completely myself. Not Noah Hamilton, the Omega who'd been widowed too young. Not Noah Hamilton, the political pawn in a family's business games. Just Noah. Loved by someone who saw me as a person rather than a designation or an opportunity. And that, I thought as Benjamin's hand traced gentle patterns on my arm and the city lights sparkled like earthbound stars below us, was worth everything.